Deputy Parks Director Clement Ashford's voice cut across the morning stillness of Veterans Memorial Park like a blade. "Sir, I'm asking one more time. Move your cart. You are blocking access to the memorial." The old man sitting on the bench did not move. His shopping cart, filled with everything he owned in the world, rested in the morning shadow of a bronze statue depicting a soldier carrying a wounded comrade through jungle terrain. His hands, weathered and scarred, remained folded in his lap with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. What Ashford did not know, what no one in this park knew, was that in exactly 43 minutes he would be on his knees, weeping, begging forgiveness from the man he was currently threatening to have arrested. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the grass of the Memorial Plaza, and families were already arriving for the Memorial Day ceremony. Children ran between the rows of white folding chairs while parents called after them to slow down, to be respectful, to remember where they were. The American flag hung limp against the pale sky, waiting for a breeze that had not yet come. And in the center of it all, beside the bronze soldier frozen forever in his act of sacrifice, an old man in a torn jacket held together with duct tape sat perfectly still while a man in a pressed khaki uniform demanded that he disappear. Ashford stepped closer, his shadow falling across the bench. He was 44 years old, ambitious, and acutely aware that today's ceremony would be attended by a 3-star general, 2 state senators, and enough cameras to make or break a career. The homeless man on the bench was a problem, a blemish on the pristine image he had cultivated for months. And Clement Ashford did not tolerate blemishes. "I have asked you politely," he said, his voice rising just enough to ensure the nearby families could hear his authority. "I have explained that this is a solemn occasion, and still you sit here, blocking the memorial, making our guests uncomfortable." His lip curled slightly. "Do you have any idea how disrespectful this is? To sit here, looking like that, while families come to honor real heroes." The old man looked up slowly. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind and something else, something harder to name. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against skin darkened by years of exposure. His eyes were the color of river water, gray and deep, and carrying currents that did not show on the surface. "With respect, sir," he said, his voice quiet and hoarse from disuse, "I am not blocking anything. I am just sitting. I would like to stay for the ceremony, if that is all right." His voice carried a cadence that seemed out of place, something formal in it, something practiced over years until it became automatic. He said, "Sir, the way some men said amen, like a reflex built into the bone." Ashford laughed, a short, sharp sound designed to humiliate. "Stay for the ceremony." He turned slightly, playing to the audience of families now watching from a safe distance. "The ceremony is for people honoring veterans, not vagrants using them as a backdrop for sympathy." The old man did not flinch, did not look away. His hands remained folded in his lap, and Ashford noticed for the first time how still they were. Not the trembling hands of age or addiction. Still like a man who had learned to control every muscle, every movement, every breath. "I understand, sir," the old man said. "I do not mean to cause trouble." "Then move." Ashford's patience was thinning. "Take your cart and your little performance somewhere else. There's a shelter 3 blocks east. They will give you a meal and a bed, and you can pretend to be a veteran there, where no one has to see it." Something flickered in the old man's eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough for the security officer standing behind Ashford to take an unconscious step backward. Then it was gone, and the old man was just an old man again, weathered and worn and taking up space on a bench that Ashford needed empty. The shopping cart beside him held everything he owned. A rolled sleeping bag strapped to the top with frayed bungee cords. A backpack with military-precise organization visible through its torn mesh pocket. A olive green blanket with a faded patch that might once have meant something. And tucked into the corner, wrapped in plastic against the weather, a photograph so worn that its edges had gone soft as cloth. "I served," the old man said quietly. "I am not pretending." Ashford rolled his eyes. "Of course you did." He pulled the radio from his belt. Every homeless man in America served, apparently. Special forces, Navy SEALs, secret missions. "I have heard all. He keyed the radio. "This is Ashford. I need additional security at the main memorial. We have a trespasser who needs to be removed before the ceremony begins." The old man looked up at the statue behind him. The bronze soldier was frozen mid-stride, carrying a wounded comrade across his shoulders, their bodies tilted forward against an invisible weight. The sculptor had captured something in the soldier's face. Not heroism exactly, something more like exhaustion. Like a man who had gone past the limits of what a body could endure and simply kept going because stopping was not an option. He carried 7 men, the old man said, almost to himself, 2 miles through enemy territory. Took him 14 hours. Ashford barely glanced at the plaque. "I know what the statue represents. I work here. What I do not know is why you think sitting next to it entitles you to stay." The old man's hand moved to his chest, touching something beneath his jacket. Dog tags. Ashford could see the thin chain at the man's neck, disappearing beneath layers of worn fabric. "I'm not asking for anything, sir. Just to stay. Just to see the ceremony. Then I will go. You have my word." "Your word." Ashford stepped closer, using his height to loom over the seated man. "And what exactly is the word of a man like you worth?" The old man looked at him for a long moment. The scar on his face seemed to deepen in the morning light, a roadmap of violence written into his skin. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried. Once he said it was worth 7 lives. But Ashford was not listening. He was already waving over the approaching security officers, already planning how to remove this eyesore as efficiently as possible, already rehearsing the story he would tell about maintaining the dignity of the memorial against those who would exploit it. He did not notice the way the old man's posture had changed, the way his shoulders had squared, his spine straightened, his chin lifted almost imperceptibly. He did not see the transformation that flickered across that weathered face, there and gone in the space of a breath. And he certainly did not notice the way the bronze soldier's face, frozen forever in its expression of exhausted determination, bore an exact resemblance to the man sitting in its shadow. The same jaw, the same brow, the same scar running from temple to chin, the same man separated by 56 years and a war that never really ended. 2 more security officers crossed the plaza, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Families pulled their children closer, watching the confrontation with the uncomfortable fascination of people who knew they should look away but could not. And in the distance, just arriving at the edge of the park, a 70-year-old man with a permanent limp was helping his grandchildren out of a minivan, unaware that the ghost he had been searching for, the man who had carried him bleeding through 2 miles of jungle, was 40 yards away and about to be arrested. "I am calling park security," Ashford said, radio already in hand. "You have 5 minutes to move, or I will have you removed in handcuffs." And the old man looked up at the bronze soldier frozen mid-stride above him, carrying his burden through an eternal jungle, and said nothing at all. He had arrived at the park at 4 in the morning, the same as every other day for the past 8 years. The streets were empty at that hour, the memorial plaza lit only by the pale glow of security lights that cast long shadows across the bronze soldier's frozen form. Ezra Josiah Whitfield moved through the darkness with the silence of a man who had spent decades learning how not to be seen. The statue stood 12 feet tall on its granite pedestal, and every morning before the sun rose, Ezra would stop at its base and rest his hand against the bronze boot of the soldier carrying his burden. The metal was always cold, even in summer. Cold like river water. Cold like the night he had made that final trip through the jungle with Teddy Calloway bleeding out across his shoulders. "Still here, brothers," he whispered into the darkness. Still trying. It was a ritual, a penance, a promise he had made to men who could no longer hear him, spoken aloud because silence felt too much like forgetting. 7 names were tattooed around his wrist in small script. And sometimes in the pre-dawn quiet, he would trace each letter with his fingertip and remember the weight of each man across his back. Corporal Theodore Calloway, Private First Class Marcus Reinhold, Lance Corporal David Y. Sergeant William Fontaine, Private Jerome Hadley, Corporal Samuel Okonkwo, Lance Corporal Peter Stanhope. 7 men, 7 trips, 14 hours through enemy territory with nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant crack of Lieutenant Harlan Yancey's rifle keeping the darkness at bay. Harlan had not made it. Harlan had charged a machine gun nest with an empty rifle and a Ka-Bar knife so that Ezra could bring the last man home. Harlan had died with his compass still in his pocket, and Ezra had carried that compass for 56 years like a stone he could not put down. He reached into his jacket now, fingers finding the worn brass case by touch alone. The compass had not worked in decades. The glass was cracked, the needle frozen in place, pointing forever toward a direction that no longer mattered. But he carried it anyway, because putting it down would mean accepting that Harlan was truly gone, and some mornings that acceptance felt like more weight than he could bear. The security lights flickered overhead, and Ezra settled onto his bench to wait for sunrise. His cart was positioned exactly where it always was, close enough to touch, far enough not to block the path. 8 years of practice had taught him the precise geometry of invisibility. Where to sit so that joggers would not complain. Where to park so that groundskeepers would leave him alone. How to exist in the margins of a world that had decided he did not belong. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. The photograph was the last thing he looked at before the sun rose. He pulled it from its plastic wrapping with the care of a man handling holy relics, tilting it toward the security light to see the faces he had memorized long ago. Loretta smiled up at him from 23 years in the past, her dark hair falling across her shoulders, her hand resting on the arm of a 17-year-old girl who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Maylene, his daughter, taken the day before he shipped out for his 3rd tour, when she still believed her father was a hero and he still believed he deserved to come home to them. Loretta had died on a Tuesday in October. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to the end, and Ezra had sat beside her bed for every single day, holding her hand while she slipped away piece by piece. She had not complained, had not raged against the unfairness of it. She had simply looked at him with those eyes that had always seen past his silences and said, "Take care of our girl, Ezra. Promise me." He had promised. And 6 months later, he had broken that promise in the most cowardly way possible. The note had taken him 3 hours to write. 3 hours of starting and stopping, of crumpling paper and throwing it against the wall, of trying to find words for a wound that had no language. In the end, he had kept it simple. "I'm sorry. I have failed you and your mother. Live your life. Do not look for me. Do not look for a ghost." He had left in the night, taking nothing but his dog tags and Harlan's compass and the photograph he now held in trembling hands. He had walked until his feet bled, then walked some more. He had disappeared into the margins of a country that had no place for men like him, men who had given everything and still felt they had not given enough. The guilt was not that he had survived the war. The guilt was that he had survived the peace, that he had come home to Loretta and Maylene and been given 40 years of love he did not deserve. And when Loretta died, he had realized the truth that had been eating at him since 1969. He should have been the one to die, not Harlan. Not the 17 Marines he had watched fall in other firefights. Not Loretta, who had spent her whole life loving a man who was more ghost than husband. He should have died on the Perfume River with a wounded man across his back and enemy fire lighting up the jungle. That was the death he had earned. Everything after was borrowed time. And when Loretta stopped breathing, he realized the debt had finally come due. Maylene was out there somewhere, he knew. Probably teaching now. She had always loved history, had always asked him questions about the war that he could never answer. She was probably married, probably happy, probably better off believing her father had died in some anonymous shelter rather than knowing he had chosen to leave. He hoped she had forgotten him. It was easier that way, easier for her to remember the man he had been before Loretta died, before the grief had broken something in him that was already cracked. Easier for her to believe in the hero her mother had always described rather than the hollow wreck he had become. But God help him, some mornings he wondered what she looked like now, whether she had children, whether she ever stood in front of a classroom and talked about Vietnam and thought about the father who had never been able to talk about it at all. The sun was beginning to rise now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Families would start arriving soon. The ceremony would begin, and Ezra would sit on his bench and watch strangers honor a sacrifice they would never understand, made by a man they would never recognize. He looked up at the statue again. The bronze soldier's face was lit by the morning sun, the scar on his cheek casting a thin shadow across the metal. 56 years separated them, but the face was the same. The jaw, the brow, the exhausted determination that the sculptor had somehow captured in frozen metal. No one ever noticed. No one ever looked at the homeless man on the bench, and then at the statue, and saw the same man looking back. The weathering of age and grief had done its work too well. The hero and the vagrant occupied the same space, invisible to each other, connected only by memory and metal and the weight of names tattooed around a wrist. That is how Ashford had found him 3 hours later, sitting in the shadow of his own monument, waiting for a ceremony that would honor a man everyone assumed was dead. Maylene was out there somewhere. He thought again. And the funny thing about carrying the dead, he had learned, was that they never got lighter. Harlan Yancey's compass weighed exactly 2 ounces. It had weighed 2 ounces for 56 years. And every single day, somehow, it felt heavier. The 2 security officers who crossed the plaza were young, barely older than the grandsons Ezra had never met. They walked with the careful authority of men who had been trained to handle situations but had never truly faced one. Their hands rested on their belts, not on their weapons, and Ezra recognized the uncertainty in their posture. They did not want to be here. They did not want to arrest an old man on Memorial Day while families watched and children pointed and cameras captured every moment. Ashford had no such hesitation. He stepped forward to meet them, his voice carrying across the plaza with theatrical precision. This individual has been asked repeatedly to vacate the premises. He is trespassing on county property and creating a disturbance during a solemn memorial event. I want him removed. Now, the taller the 2 officers glanced at Ezra, then back at Ashford. Sir, he is just sitting on a bench. That is not exactly trespassing. Ashford's face reddened. He is blocking access to the memorial. The officer looked at the cart, positioned carefully to one side of the path, blocking nothing. He looked at the bench, a public bench on public property. He looked at the old man, sitting perfectly still with his hands folded in his lap, causing no disturbance beyond the crime of existing in a space where Clement Ashford did not want him to exist. Sir, the officer said carefully, I am not sure we have grounds to remove him. Then find grounds. Ashford's voice dropped to a hiss. Do you understand what today is? Do you understand who is coming? A 3-star general, state senators, television cameras, and you want to explain to all of them why we allowed a vagrant to turn this memorial into his personal campground? The word vagrant hung in the air. Ezra did not react. He had been called worse by better men in worse places. But the families watching from the rows of white chairs shifted uncomfortably, and a few of them began to whisper among themselves. A woman in her 50s, seated in the second row with a teenage girl beside her, turned to look at the confrontation. Something about the old man's posture caught her attention. The way he held himself despite the verbal assault. The way his spine remained straight and his shoulders squared even as insults rained down upon him. She had seen that posture before, in old photographs, in the mirror of memory. Mom, the teenage girl whispered, tugging at her sleeve. What is happening over there? The woman did not answer. She was staring at the old man's profile, at the scar running from his temple to his jaw, at something she could not quite name, but could not look away from. Across the plaza, at the edge of the parking lot, Theodore Calloway was helping his youngest grandson out of the minivan when he heard the raised voices. He straightened slowly, his permanent limp making the motion difficult, and squinted toward the memorial. His wife touched his arm. "Teddy, what is it?" "Nothing," he said. "Probably nothing." But he did not move. He stood there in the morning sun, watching the distant figures near the statue, watching the old man on the bench who sat so still he might have been carved from the same bronze as the soldier above him. Back at the confrontation, Ashford had changed tactics. He stepped closer to Ezra, close enough that his shadow fell across the old man's face, and lowered his voice to something approaching intimacy, something the nearby families could not quite hear, but could certainly see. "Look at yourself," he said. "Just look." His gesture encompassed Ezra's torn jacket, his weathered hands, his cart filled with the debris of a life lived in margins. "You think anyone here wants to see this?" This memorial honors heroes, men who sacrificed everything, not someone who gave up on himself and expects the rest of us to carry him. Ezra looked up. His river-gray eyes met Ashford's, and for just a moment, something shifted in their depths. Something old and cold and infinitely patient. "With respect, sir," he said, his voice still quiet, still formal, still carrying that automatic courtesy that seemed built into his bones, "I have not given up on anything." Ashford laughed. The sound was sharp and theatrical, designed to be heard. "Sure you have not. Let me guess. You are a veteran too, right?" His voice dripped with contempt. "They all say that. Every homeless man in America apparently stormed the beaches at Normandy or took out Bin Laden personally. It is always the same story." "Yes, sir," Ezra said simply. "I served." "Right." Ashford turned to the security officers with an exaggerated shrug. "And I am a 5-star general." He turned back to Ezra, jabbing a finger toward the cart. "Now move. Take your sad little act somewhere else before I have these officers help you move." The families were watching openly now. Some had pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation without quite knowing why. A few veterans in the crowd, identifiable by their caps and pins and the particular way they held themselves, had risen from their seats and were drifting closer. Their faces were unreadable, but their eyes were fixed on the old man and the scar on his face and the stillness of his weathered hands. In the second row, the woman in her 50s stood abruptly. Her daughter grabbed her arm. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I need to see something," she said. Her voice was strange, distant, like she was listening to a frequency no one else could hear. She began walking toward the confrontation, weaving between the white, folding chairs, her eyes never leaving the old man on the bench. She did not know why, could not have explained if asked, but something was pulling her forward, some magnetic force she could not name or resist. The old man on the bench did not see her coming. He was looking up at the statue now, at the bronze soldier frozen forever in his act of impossible courage, and his lips were moving silently, forming words no one else could hear. Names, perhaps. Prayers. Apologies to the dead who never asked for them. And 30 yards away, Theodore Calloway had finally started walking. His limp was more pronounced now, his pace quickening despite the pain in his leg that had never fully healed. His wife called after him, asking where he was going, but he did not answer. He could not answer, because he had just seen the old man's profile clearly for the first time, had seen the scar and the set of the jaw and the way he sat at attention even under assault. It could not be him. Everyone said he was dead. 8 years of searching, of hiring investigators, of following every lead to every dead end. Everyone said Anchor was gone. Another veteran lost to the streets, to the bottle, to the long, slow war that followed every soldier home. But that scar running from temple to jaw, earned on the night everything changed, visible even now across the distance of the plaza. Calloway had traced that scar with his own fingers once, in the darkness of a helicopter bay, while Ezra Whitfield held pressure on the wound in his leg and told him to stay awake, stay talking, stay alive. That scar was the last thing he had seen before he passed out, and he was seeing it again now. She had told this story 100 times, to students who needed to believe in something, to her daughter who had never met her grandfather. She did not know why she always felt closest to him here, at this statue of a hero she had never met. Maybe because this was what her father should have been. Maybe because this was the kind of man she wished he had become. The perfumed river ran red that night. Ezra remembered it in fragments. The way the mind protects itself from memories too heavy to carry whole. The smell of cordite and copper. The weight of a man across his shoulders. The sound of Harlan Yancey's rifle cracking through the darkness like a promise. January 15th, 1969. He had been 29 years old, a gunnery sergeant with 1st Force Reconnaissance Company, and he had already seen enough death to know that survival was mostly luck and timing and the willingness to keep moving when every muscle screamed for rest. The ambush had come at dusk. 3rd Platoon had been running a patrol along the river when the jungle erupted in fire and noise and the particular chaos that only combat could create. Within minutes, 7 Marines were down. Wounded, bleeding, trapped in a position that was quickly becoming overrun. No extraction possible. No support within range. Just the river and the jungle and the enemy closing in from 3 sides. Ezra had been 2 miles north with his reconnaissance team when the radio crackled with the distress call. He remembered looking at Harlan, his platoon commander, and seeing the same calculation in his eyes. 2 miles through enemy territory. 7 wounded men. No guarantee any of them would survive the night. "We go," Harlan had said. Simple as that. "We go." They had moved through the jungle like ghosts, silent and swift, arriving at the ambush site to find carnage. 4 Marines dead. 7 wounded. The survivors huddled behind what remained of their defensive position, firing into the darkness at shadows that kept coming. Ezra had carried the first man out at 9 in the evening. Corporal Theodore Calloway, 22 years old, bleeding from shrapnel wound in his leg that had nicked the femoral artery. Ezra had tied his own shirt around the wound, hoisted Calloway across his shoulders, and started walking. 2 miles through enemy territory, through the river that soaked his boots and numbed his legs, through jungle so thick he had to feel his way by touch, through the sound of gunfire behind him, Harlan's rifle keeping the darkness at bay. He made it to the extraction zone at 11, handed Calloway to the medics. Turned around, walked back, 6 more times, 6 more men, 2 miles each way, through the same water, the same jungle, the same darkness. His muscles screaming, his lungs burning, his mind going somewhere quiet and still where pain could not follow. Private First Class Marcus Reinhold, 19, shot through both legs. Lance Corporal David Yee, 23, shrapnel in his abdomen. Sergeant William Fontaine, 31, bullet wound to the shoulder. Private Jerome Hadley, 18, the youngest of them, crying for his mother while Ezra carried him through water that reached his chest. Corporal Samuel Okonkwo, 25, unconscious from blood loss, dead weight across Ezra's back. Lance Corporal Peter Stanhope, 24, the last one, the one Harlan had died for. The 7th trip had almost killed him. His body had gone past exhaustion into something else, some mechanical state where muscles moved without conscious command. He had been halfway across the river when he heard the change in the gunfire behind him. Harlan's rifle falling silent. Then a sound he would never forget. A roar of defiance, of rage, of a man who knew he was about to die and chose to die running toward the enemy instead of away. Harlan Yancey had charged a machine gun nest with an empty rifle and a Ka-Bar knife. He had bought Ezra 90 seconds. 90 seconds to cross the last stretch of river, to reach the Trilene, to deliver the 7th man to the extraction helicopter that was already spinning up its rotors. Ezra had tried to go back, had screamed at the pilot to wait, to give him 5 more minutes, to let him retrieve the body of the man who had saved them all. But the pilot had orders, and the enemy was closing, and the helicopter had lifted off with Ezra still fighting to get free. He had watched the jungle disappear beneath him, had watched the muzzle flashes fade into darkness, had known with absolute certainty that he was leaving behind the best man he had ever known. The compass had been in Harlan's pocket when they recovered his body 3 weeks later. Cracked glass, frozen needle, still pointing toward a direction that no longer mattered. Ezra had carried it ever since, a 2-ounce piece of brass that weighed more than all 7 men combined. Sitting on the bench now, 56 years later, he could still feel the weight of each man across his shoulders. Could still hear Harlan's voice in the darkness, steady and calm, calling out targets while his ammunition ran low. Could still smell the river water and the cordite and the copper tang of blood. The statue above him captured none of it. Could not capture the cold or the fear or the way his lungs had burned on that 7th trip. Could not capture Harlan's final charge or the sound of the helicopter lifting off or the weight of survivor's guilt that had settled into his bones like lead. But it tried. The sculptor had tried. Had given the bronze soldier a face twisted with exhaustion. Had bent his body forward against an invisible burden. Had frozen him forever in the act of carrying his brother home. Ezra touched the compass in his pocket. The brass was warm from his body heat, the only warmth he had felt all morning. Still here, Harlan, he whispered. Still trying. But Harlan could not answer. Harlan had been silent for 56 years, and the only voice Ezra heard now was Ashford's, sharp and contemptuous, demanding that he leave the only place where the dead could still find him. The funny thing about carrying the dead, he had learned, was that they never got lighter. Harlan Yancey's compass weighed exactly 2 ounces. It had weighed 2 ounces for 56 years. And every single day, somehow, it felt heavier than the 7 men he had carried through the perfume river on the night that made him a legend and broke him forever. He looked up at the bronze soldier's face. His own face, younger and stronger and frozen in bronze, staring back at him without recognition. "I should have been faster," he said quietly. The words he had never spoken aloud. The words that had lived in his chest for 56 years like a stone he could not swallow or spit out. "I should have been faster. Then you would be here, and I would be the one remembered on a wall somewhere." The statue did not answer. Statues never did. But somewhere in the crowd, a woman was pushing forward with tears in her eyes, and somewhere else, a man with a permanent limp was almost running, and somewhere in the space between memory and mourning, the dead were stirring. Ashford was losing patience. The security officers had not moved to arrest the old man. The families were watching with increasing disapproval, and somewhere behind him he could hear the sounds of the ceremony preparation grinding to a halt as more people turned to observe the confrontation. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You have exactly 2 minutes to remove yourself from this property, or I will have you arrested for trespassing, disorderly conduct, and whatever else I can make stick. Do you understand me?" Ezra looked at him with those river-gray eyes that seemed to see past the surface of things, past the pressed uniform and the manufactured authority, down to something Ashford did not want examined. "I understand, sir," he said, "but I would like to stay for the ceremony, just until it is over. Then I will go quietly." "The ceremony?" Ashford laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "The ceremony is for families, for veterans, for people who actually contributed something to this country, not for whatever you are." A voice cut across the plaza, quiet but carrying. "That is enough." Marcus Delane had arrived without anyone noticing. He was 58 years old, built like a man who had once carried heavy things for a living, and he wore the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by bureaucratic bluster. He ran the Veterans Outreach Center 3 blocks east, and he had been trying to help Ezra Whitfield for nearly 6 years without success. Marcus stepped between Ashford and the bench, his presence a physical barrier. This man has not broken any laws. He is sitting on a public bench in a public park. If you want to have him arrested, you will need to explain to the television cameras why the Parks Department spent Memorial Day harassing an elderly veteran. Ashford's face reddened. "You do not know he is a veteran. He could be anyone. He could be lying." Marcus did not look away. "Could be. But I have worked with homeless veterans for 15 years, and I know the real ones when I see them. The way they stand, the way they speak, the way they carry something invisible that never goes away." He glanced back at Ezra. "This man is the real thing. I would bet my life on it." Ezra looked up at Marcus with something that might have been gratitude or might have been grief. "Marcus," he said quietly, "you do not have to do this. I do not want to cause trouble." "You are not causing trouble, brother." Marcus turned back to Ashford. "He is. Big difference. Ashford opened his mouth to respond, but another voice interrupted him. This one came from across the plaza, from a man pushing through the crowd with a limp that made each step a small act of defiance. "Let me through." Theodore Calloway's voice was hoarse, urgent, carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with age. "Please, let me through." The crowd parted for him. Something in his face, in the desperate way he was moving, made people step aside without question. His wife was calling after him, his grandchildren confused and following at a distance. But Calloway did not slow down. Could not slow down. He reached the edge of the confrontation and stopped. His chest was heaving, his bad leg throbbing, his eyes fixed on the old man sitting on the bench beneath the bronze soldier's shadow. Ezra looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither man spoke. 56 years collapsed into a single breath. The jungle and the river and the weight of a wounded man across tired shoulders. The crack of a rifle in the darkness. The sound of a helicopter lifting off while someone screamed to go back. Calloway's voice came out broken, a whisper that somehow carried across the silent plaza. Anchor? The word hung in the air like smoke, like prayer, like the name of a ghost who had finally decided to appear. Ezra's face did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, some wall crumbling that had stood for 8 years of silence and solitude and self-imposed exile. "Hello, Teddy," he said. His voice was barely audible. "You still limp. I told you to let me carry you right. You kept kicking." Calloway made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He took a step forward, then another, his limp more pronounced than ever, but his pace unstoppable. "You shot me in the leg, and I was heavy. I did not shoot you." Ezra's voice cracked on the words. "I just did not dodge the same bullet you did not dodge." And then Calloway was there, standing in front of the bench, tears streaming down his weathered face, his hand reaching out to touch the shoulder of a man he had spent 8 years believing was dead. "We thought you were gone," he said. His voice was shaking. 8 years. 8 years I have been looking. Hired investigators. Followed every lead. Everyone said you were dead. Everyone said Anchor was just another veteran lost to the streets. Ezra looked down at his hands. The hands that had carried 7 men through the darkness. The hands that had held Loretta while she died. The hands that had written a note to his daughter and walked away from everything he had ever loved. "Maybe they were right," he said quietly. "Maybe I've been dead. Just forgot to stop breathing." Calloway gripped his shoulder harder. "No, no, you do not get to say that. You do not get to sit here beside your own statue and pretend you are nothing." His voice broke completely. "You carried me, Ezra, 2 miles through enemy territory with my blood soaking through your shirt. You saved my life. You saved all of us." Ashford had gone pale. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his manufactured authority crumbling in the face of something he could not understand or control. Behind him, the crowd had grown completely still. Phones were raised, recording every moment. Veterans in the audience had risen to their feet, their faces transformed by recognition of something sacred happening before their eyes. And in the second row of white, folding chairs, a woman in her 50s had stopped walking. Her hand was pressed against her chest, her breath coming in short gasps, her eyes fixed on the old man being embraced by a stranger who was calling him by a name she had not heard in 20 years. Anchor, her father's call sign. The name her mother had spoken with such pride, such reverence, such love. The name of a hero she had been told was gone forever. Her daughter was pulling at her arm, asking what was wrong, why she was crying, who was that man, but she could not answer, could not speak, could only stare at the scar running from temple to jaw, the same scar she had traced with her child's fingers when she was small, asking Daddy, "Does it hurt?" "It always hurts," he had told her. "But that is okay. Some things are supposed to hurt. That is how you know they mattered." She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving without conscious command, carrying her toward a confrontation that was about to become something else entirely. The plaza had gone silent in a way that felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that falls in churches and hospitals in the moments before a soldier's casket is lowered into the ground. Even the children had stopped running, sensing something in the air that their young minds could not name, but their hearts understood. Calloway was still gripping Ezra's shoulder, tears cutting tracks through the weathered lines of his face. His wife had reached him now, standing just behind with her hand pressed to her mouth, watching her husband weep over a ghost who had decided to become flesh again. "You have to understand," Calloway was saying, his voice raw. "When you disappeared, when no one could find you, we thought the worst. The 7 of us, we got together every year on the anniversary, raised a glass to Anchor, told our grandchildren about the man who carried us home. And every year we wondered where you were, whether you were okay, whether you even knew we were still alive because of you." Ezra shook his head slowly. "I knew. I always knew." "Then why?" Calloway's voice cracked. "Why did you disappear? Why did you let us think you were dead?" Ezra looked up at the statue. The bronze soldier stared back, frozen in eternal sacrifice, carrying his burden toward a destination he would never reach. "Because I did not save everyone," Ezra said quietly. "Because Harlan died, so I could bring you home. Because I spent 40 years looking at my family and knowing I did not deserve them. And when Loretta passed, I could not pretend anymore." Calloway was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harlan Yancey was my friend too. We all loved him. But he made a choice, Ezra. He chose to give us a chance. And you honor that choice by bringing us home. You cannot carry his death like it was your failure." Ezra's hand moved to his chest, touching the shape of the compass beneath his jacket. "I carry it because someone has to. Because if I put it down, it means he is really gone." Around them, the crowd was pressing closer. Word was spreading through the plaza in whispers and gasps. "That is him, the one from the statue. He has been here the whole time." Phones were raised, recording everything. And somewhere in the back, a journalist named Phoebe Rasmussen was already composing the first lines of a story that would go national before sunset. Ashford stood frozen at the edge of the confrontation, his face the color of old paper. The security officers behind him had stepped back, wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. His radio hung limp in his hand, forgotten. "I do not know," he said. His voice was thin, stripped of its earlier authority. "I did not know who he was." No one acknowledged him. No one even looked at him. He had become invisible, irrelevant, a footnote in a story that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the man who had bled and carried and survived. Calloway turned to the crowd, his voice stronger now, carrying across the silent plaza. "This man is Gunnery Sergeant Ezra Josiah Whitfield. Call sign Anchor. 1st Force Reconnaissance Company." On January 15th, 1969, he carried 7 wounded Marines 2 miles through enemy territory, made 7 trips through the jungle, through the river, through enemy fire. 14 hours without rest. He saved all of us. He pointed up at the statue. "That is him. That is his face. We built this memorial 15 years ago to honor what he did, and we have been looking for him ever since." He turned back to Ezra, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "And he has been here the whole time, sitting beside his own statue, watching strangers honor a man they did not recognize." The crowd erupted, not in applause, not in cheers, but in something rawer. A collective gasp that became a murmur that became a wave of emotion rolling across the plaza. Veterans in the audience were standing at attention, their hands rising in salute. Families were pulling their children close, explaining in hushed voices what they were witnessing. And somewhere near the podium, Lieutenant General Cornelius Burgess had abandoned his prepared remarks entirely and was pushing through the crowd toward the confrontation. Ezra sat perfectly still through all of it. His face was unreadable, his hands folded in his lap with that same unnatural stillness that had unnerved Ashford earlier. But his eyes were not still. His eyes were moving through the crowd, searching, looking for something or someone, a desperate hope he did not dare speak aloud. And then he found her. Maylene had stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the scar clearly now, the one that ran from his temple to his jaw, the one she had traced with her fingers as a child. Close enough to see the gray in his eyes that matched the gray in her own. Close enough to see the photograph sticking out of his jacket pocket, worn soft at the edges, showing two faces she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, but in the silence of the plaza, it carried like a thunderclap. "Dad?" Ezra's composure shattered. The wall he had built over 8 years of solitude, 8 years of penance, 8 years of watching his daughter from the shadows without ever letting her see him, it crumbled in an instant. Maylene. Her name broke in his throat. Baby girl. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, her hands clenched at her sides, her whole body trembling with emotions she could not begin to name. 8 years, she said. 8 years I've been looking for you. I hired detectives. I put up flyers. I went to every shelter in 3 states. And you have been here, the whole time, sitting beside a statue of yourself. I could not, Ezra started, but his voice failed him. Could not what? Her voice rose, grief and fury tangled together. Could not pick up a phone? Could not let me know you were alive? Could not let me help you? I did not deserve it. The words came out raw, stripped of all pretense. I did not deserve help. I did not deserve you. After your mother died, I looked at you, and all I could see was her. All I could feel was how I had failed her, how I had spent 40 years being more ghost than husband. He looked down at his hands. I thought I was protecting you. By leaving. By disappearing. I thought you would be better off remembering the man I used to be instead of watching the man I had become. Maylene took a step forward. Then another. Her voice was softer now, but no less fierce. You were wrong, she said. You were so wrong. I did not need you to be perfect. I did not need you to be the hero from that statue. I just needed you to be my father. She was close enough to touch him now, close enough to see the tears carving tracks through the grime on his weathered face. I just needed you to stay. Ezra looked up at his daughter, at the woman she had become, at her mother's eyes looking back at him from a face that carried pieces of both of them. I am sorry, he whispered, the words he had carried for 8 years, the words he had been too afraid to speak. I am so sorry, Maylene. I am so sorry. She reached out. Her hand touched his shoulder. The first human contact with kindness he had felt in 8 years. And then she pulled him to his feet and wrapped her arms around him. And Ezra Whitfield, call sign Anchor, who had carried 7 men through enemy territory without breaking, finally broke completely. He held her the way he had held the wounded men in the jungle. Like if he let go, she would disappear. Like the darkness would swallow her the way it had swallowed Harlan, the way it had swallowed Loretta, the way it had tried to swallow him for the past 8 years. Maylene was crying into his shoulder, her body shaking with sobs she had been holding back for nearly a decade. All the anger, all the grief, all the desperate hope that had kept her searching long after everyone told her to stop. It poured out of her now, soaking into the worn fabric of his jacket, mixing with the dust and the years and the weight of everything left unsaid. I thought you were dead, she whispered against his chest. Every time the phone rang, I thought it would be someone telling me they found your body. Every time I saw a homeless man on the street, I looked for your face. I never stopped looking, Dad. I never stopped. Ezra could not speak. His throat had closed around words too heavy to lift. He just held her tighter, his scarred hands gripping the back of her jacket like she was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Around them, the plaza had become a cathedral of silence. Hundreds of people stood motionless, bearing witness to something that felt too private to watch but too sacred to look away from. Children pressed against their parents' legs, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding it. Veterans stood at attention, tears streaming down weathered faces, remembering their own homecomings or the homecomings that never came. Iris had approached slowly, standing a few feet away with her father David's hand on her shoulder. She was 17, the same age Maylene had been in the photograph Ezra carried. The same stubborn jaw, the same dark hair. Looking at her was like looking through a window into the past. Mom? Iris's voice was small, uncertain. Is this really him? Is this really Grandpa? Maylene pulled back just enough to look at her daughter, one arm still wrapped around her father's waist as if afraid he might vanish again. Yes, baby. This is him. This is your grandfather. Ezra looked at the girl, at the granddaughter he had never met, Never held, never taught to fish or watched Graduate or told stories about the war he could never talk about. 17 years of her life, and he had missed all of it. 17 years of birthday candles and scraped knees and first days of school. And he had been sitting on a bench 3 hours away, believing he did not deserve to witness any of it. "Iris," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Your name is Iris." She nodded, eyes wide, not sure what to do with this weathered stranger who was suddenly family. "Your grandmother loved Iris's," Ezra continued, the words coming slowly, painfully like stones being pulled from deep water. "She had a garden full of them, purple and yellow and white. She said they reminded her of hope, of things that bloom even when the winter seems endless." He reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out the photograph. Loretta and Maylene, frozen in time, smiling at a camera held by a man who would spend the next 40 years trying to deserve that smile. "I have carried this every day," he said, holding it out toward Iris. "Every day for 23 years. Your grandmother gave it to me the morning I shipped out for my third tour. She said as long as I had it, I would always find my way home." His voice broke, but I stopped believing I had a home to find. After she died, after I left, I thought home was something I had lost the right to, something I had forfeited when I walked away. Iris looked at the photograph, at the grandmother she had only known through stories, and the mother who was younger than she was now. Then she looked up at the old man with the scar on his face and the tears in his eyes. "You could have come back," she said. Her voice was not accusatory, just confused, trying to understand. "We would have wanted you back. Mom never stopped wanting you back." "I know." Ezra's voice was barely audible. "I know that now. I think I knew it then too. But knowing and believing are different things. And I had stopped believing I deserved anything good." David stepped forward, extending his hand. Ezra looked at it for a moment, then took it. The handshake was firm, steady, the grip of a man who understood that some things could not be fixed with words. "I have heard a lot about you," David said. "Maylene has a box of your medals in our closet. She takes them out every Veterans Day, shows them to her students, tells them about the father who carried 7 men through a jungle and then vanished into thin air." Ezra flinched at the word vanished. It was too accurate, too precise a description of what he had done. "I did not vanish," he said quietly. "I was right here, the whole time. I came to see your graduate from college. I was in the back row. I came to your wedding. I watched from across the street. I was there when Iris was born. I sat in a hospital parking lot for 6 hours, waiting to see Maylene come out with the baby." Maylene made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "You were there?" "I was always there." Ezra's voice cracked. "I just could not let you see me, could not let you know what I had become. I thought watching from a distance was enough. I thought knowing you were happy would be enough to keep me going." He looked up at the statue looming above them, the bronze soldier carrying his burden through an eternal jungle. But it was not enough, he whispered. "Nothing is ever enough when you are carrying something you were never meant to carry alone." Calloway had stepped back to give the family space, but he was still close enough to hear. His own family surrounded him now, grandchildren clutching his hands, his wife's arm around his waist. 3 generations of family that existed because a man had made 7 trips through the darkness. "You were never supposed to carry it alone," Calloway said softly. "That is what we try to tell you. That is what the statue was supposed to mean. You carried us. Now, let us carry you." Ezra looked at the faces surrounding him. His daughter, his granddaughter, his son-in-law, the man he had saved 56 years ago. The strangers who had stopped being strangers the moment the truth came out. For 8 years, he had believed he was invisible, forgotten, unworthy of the love he had once taken for granted. But love, he was beginning to understand, did not work that way. Love did not forget. Love did not stop looking. Love stood in hospital parking lots and wedding ceremonies and graduation ceremonies, even when it was too afraid to walk through the door. "I do not know how to come back," he said finally. His voice was raw, honest, stripped of all pretense. "I have been gone so long. I do not know how to be a father anymore, or a grandfather. I do not know how to be anything except what I have been." Maylene took his face in her hands, the same gesture her mother had used 1,000 times. The same gentle firmness. The same love that refused to let go. Then we will figure out together, she said. One day at a time. You do not have to know how. You just have to stay. He looked into his daughter's eyes and saw Loretta looking back at him. Saw the forgiveness he had never dared to ask for. Saw the home he had spent 8 years believing he had lost. Okay, he whispered. Okay, I will stay. The moment might have stretched on forever, suspended in the amber of memory, if not for the sound of boots on gravel. Heavy, purposeful, carrying the unmistakable cadence of military precision. Lieutenant General Cornelius Wayland Burgess had served 42 years in the United States Marine Corps. He had commanded battalions and brigades, had sent men into combat and written letters to their widows, had stood at more funerals than he could count, and delivered more folded flags than he wanted to remember. He was 78 years old, and he had thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. The crowd parted for him the way water parts for a ship's prow. His dress uniform was immaculate, medals gleaming in the morning sun, but his face was pale and his hands were not quite steady. He had heard the commotion from the podium, had heard the name Anchor spoken aloud, had pushed through the crowd to see for himself the ghost of a legend he had studied at the basic school 4 decades ago. Gunnery Sergeant Whitfield, he said. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise it. I am Lieutenant General Burgess. I was supposed to give the keynote address today. He stopped 3 feet away, his eyes taking in the worn jacket, the weathered face, the scar that matched the one on the bronze soldier above them. I studied the Perfume River extraction at Quantico in 1974, he continued. It was required reading. 7 trips through enemy territory. 14 hours without rest. Lieutenant Yancey's final stand. He paused, something shifting in his expression. We use it to teach young officers what courage looks like, what sacrifice means, what it costs to bring your brothers home. Ezra stood perfectly still, his daughter's hand still gripping his arm. He did not know what to say, did not know what was expected of him. For 8 years, he had been invisible, and now the whole world seemed to be staring. Sir, he managed. I was just doing my job. Burgess shook his head slowly. No, you were doing something far beyond any job, any duty, any reasonable expectation of what one man could accomplish. He turned to look at the statue, then back at Ezra. We built monuments to you, named buildings after you, taught your story to generations of Marines. And all this time, you were here, sitting in the shadow of your own legacy, believing you did not deserve it. The words hit Ezra like physical blows. He swayed slightly, and Maylene's grip tightened. I lost a man, Ezra said quietly. Lieutenant Yancey. He died so I could bring the others home. That is not something you build monuments for. That is something you carry. Burgess was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice softer than before. I lost men too, he said. In Beirut, in the Gulf, in places I am not permitted to name. I have spent 40 years carrying them. Their faces, their names, the letters I wrote to their families. He met Ezra's eyes. But I learned something along the way, Gunnery Sergeant. Carrying them does not mean carrying them alone. And honoring their sacrifice does not mean punishing yourself for surviving. Behind Burgess, Ashford stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. His face had gone from pale to gray, the color of old ash. He had tried to arrest a Navy Cross recipient, had mocked a man whose story was taught at military academies, had demanded the removal of dog tags that had been worn through more combat than Ashford could comprehend. His career was over. He knew it with the cold certainty of a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. The cameras had captured everything. The journalist with the phone had captured everything. By nightfall, his name would be synonymous with exactly the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that Memorial Day was supposed to stand against. But no one was looking at Ashford. No one cared about Ashford anymore. The crowd had eyes only for the old man in the worn jacket, the general in the dress uniform, and the bronze soldier watching over them all. Burgess turned to face the crowd, his voice rising to carry across the plaza. Today was supposed to be about honoring those who served, he said, about remembering the sacrifices made by men and women in uniform, about teaching our children what it means to answer the call of duty. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I had a speech prepared. Statistics. Stories. The usual words we say on days like this. He looked back at Ezra. But I think we have something better than a speech today. We have a living reminder of what service really means. Not the medals or the monuments. Not the parades or the ceremonies. But the quiet courage of a man who carried his brothers through the fire and then spent the next 50 years carrying the weight of those he could not save. Burgess reached up and removed his cover, holding it against his chest. Gunnery Sergeant Ezra Josiah Whitfield, he said, his voice formal now, carrying the weight of ceremony. Call sign anchor. Navy Cross. Silver Star. 2 bronze stars with Valor device. 3 Purple Hearts. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, on behalf of the 7 men whose lives you saved, on behalf of every Marine who has ever heard your story and drawn strength from it, I want to say something that should have been said a long time ago. He extended his hand. Welcome home, Marine. You have been missed. Ezra looked at the hand, at the general offering it, at the crowd, standing in silence, waiting. For 8 years, he had believed he was forgotten, worthless, a ghost haunting the margins of a world that had moved on without him. He had sat beside his own statue and watched strangers honor a man they did not recognize, believing that man had died somewhere in the jungle of his own grief. But the man had not died. The man was standing here, surrounded by the daughter he had abandoned and the granddaughter he had never known and the Marine he had carried through the darkness and the general who had studied his story at Quantico. The man was still alive, and for the first time in 8 years, that felt like something other than a punishment. Ezra reached out and took the general's hand. Thank you, sir, he said. His voice was steady now, stronger, carrying a note that had been missing for a very long time. It is good to be home. And across the plaza, hundreds of hands rose in salute. The salutes held for what felt like an eternity. Veterans young and old, some in uniform, and some in civilian clothes, marked only by pins and patches and the particular way they carried themselves. Hands raised to foreheads, eyes fixed on the man who had spent 8 years believing himself invisible. Ezra did not know what to do. His body remembered the response before his mind caught up, and he found himself standing at attention, his own hand rising in a salute that felt like muscle memory and homecoming all at once. 56 years since he had earned the right to render that gesture, and his body had not forgotten, would never forget. Calloway was weeping openly now, making no effort to hide it. His grandchildren stood beside him, too young to fully understand what they were witnessing, but old enough to know it mattered. His wife had her arm around his waist, steadying him as his bad leg threatened to buckle. I never thought I would see this, Calloway said, his voice breaking. I never thought I would get to thank you properly, to tell you what you gave me. He gestured to his family, to the 3 generations standing around him. 56 years, he said. 56 years of life. My wife, my children, my grandchildren, every birthday, every Christmas, every moment I got to be a father and a grandfather and a husband. He looked at Ezra with eyes that had seen the same darkness, had survived the same night. That is what you gave me. That is what those 7 trips through the jungle meant. Not just my life, every life that came after. The other survivors began to appear. Word had spread through the crowd, through phone calls and text messages, reaching men who had driven hours to attend the ceremony and now understood why fate had brought them here today. Samuel Okonkwo's son pushed through the crowd, a man in his 50s with his father's broad shoulders and steady gaze. His father had passed 3 years ago, but he carried a photograph in his wallet that he now held up for Ezra to see. The original 7, taken at a reunion 15 years ago, gathered around the newly unveiled statue. My father talked about you every day, he said, every single day until the day he died. He said you were the reason he got to walk me to school, the reason he got to dance at my wedding, the reason he got to hold his grandchildren. Peter Stanhope came forward next, 79 years old and walking with a cane, but moving with purpose. The last man, the one Harlan Yancey had died for. I was the 7th, he said, his voice trembling. I was unconscious when you carried me out. I never got to see your face that night. Never got to thank you properly. He reached out and gripped Ezra's shoulder. But I'm thanking you now. 56 years late, But I am thanking you now. One by one they came, the survivors and their families, the children and grandchildren who existed because one man had refused to leave anyone behind. They formed a circle around Ezra, a living monument more powerful than any bronze statue, testimony written not in metal, but in flesh and blood and tears. Phoebe Rasmussen had stopped recording. Her phone hung limp at her side, forgotten. She had come looking for a local interest story, something to fill space in the Memorial Day edition. Instead, she had found something that would define her career, something that would remind people why they gathered at memorials in the first place. This is not just a story, she thought. This is why we remember. Burgess had stepped back, allowing the families their moment. But his eyes never left Ezra's face. He had seen many things in 42 years of service. Acts of courage and cowardice, triumph and tragedy, men broken by war and men reforged by it. But he had never seen anything quite like this. A hero reunited with the living proof of his heroism. A man who had spent 8 years as a ghost, suddenly surrounded by the lives he had saved. Maylene stood at her father's side, her hand still gripping his arm. Iris had moved closer, no longer uncertain, her young face wet with tears she did not bother to wipe away. David stood behind them, one hand on his wife's shoulder, the other on his daughter's, holding his family together the way families were meant to be held. "Dad," Maylene said softly, "look at them. Look at what you did." Ezra looked at the faces, at the families, at the generations that stretched out from a single night in the jungle like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. "I just carried them," he whispered. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No." Calloway's voice was firm. "Not anyone. You. You did what no one else could have done. What no one else would have even attempted. 7 trips through enemy fire. 14 hours without rest. You did not just carry us, Ezra. You carried everything we would ever become." The weight of it settled over Ezra like a blanket. Not the crushing weight he had carried for 56 years. Something different. Something lighter. The weight of being seen. Of being known. Of finally understanding that the lives he had saved were not debts he owed, but gifts he had given. Harlan's compass pressed against his chest, and for the first time, it did not feel like an anchor dragging him down. It felt like what it was. A reminder. A connection. A promise kept across half a century. Still here, Harlan, he thought. Still trying. But not alone anymore. He looked up at the statue. At his own face, cast in bronze, frozen in the act of carrying his burden home. For 15 years, that statue had stood watch over this plaza. For 8 years, he had sat in its shadow, believing himself unworthy of its gaze. But the statue was not looking down in judgment. It never had been. It was looking forward, toward the Treeline, toward safety, toward the moment when the burden could finally be set down. And standing in the morning sun, surrounded by the lives he had saved and the family he had found, Ezra Whitfield finally understood what the sculptor had been trying to capture. Not the weight of carrying, the hope of arriving. Burgess raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. The salutes lowered. The murmuring ceased. Even the birds in the trees seemed to hold their breath. "I believe," the general said, "that we owe this gathering a proper introduction. Not the introduction I had prepared. Something better. Something true." He turned to face the crowd fully, his voice carrying across the plaza with the practiced projection of a man who had addressed battalions and briefed presidents. On January 15th, 1969, a reconnaissance patrol from 1st Force Reconnaissance Company was ambushed near the Perfume River in Hue Province. 7 Marines were wounded. Their position was overrun. No extraction was possible. No support was within range. By every measure of military probability, those 7 men should have died that night. He paused, letting the silence deepen. But probability does not account for men like Gunnery Sergeant Ezra Whitfield. Call sign anchor. A man who looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible was not a word he recognized. Burgess gestured toward Ezra. "Tell them," he said. "Tell them what you did. In your own words. Let them hear it from the man who lived it." Ezra stood frozen. Every eye in the plaza was fixed on him. Hundreds of faces. Thousands of questions. A lifetime of silence pressing against his throat like a stone. Maylene squeezed his hand. You can do this, Dad. You have been carrying this alone for too long. Let them help you carry it. He looked at his daughter. At Calloway. At the faces of the men he had saved and the families they had built. At the statue above him, frozen in bronze, waiting for the story to finally be told. And then he began to speak. 16.4637 degrees north, he said. His voice was quiet at first, barely carrying past the first row. 107.5909 degrees east. January 15th, 1969. Perfume River Extraction Zone. The coordinates fell from his lips like water from a stone. Numbers he had never forgotten. Numbers tattooed into his skin and burned into his memory. His voice grew stronger. 1st Force Reconnaissance Company, attached to 3rd Marine Regiment. We received the distress call at 1800 hours. 7 Marines trapped. Position overrun. Enemy closing from 3 sides. No extraction possible for at least 6 hours. He looked at Calloway. I did not think about probability. I did not think about odds. I just knew that there were men in the darkness who needed to come home. And I knew that Harlan Yancey was the best officer I had ever served with, and he was already moving before I finished hearing the call. His hand moved to his chest, touching the compass beneath his jacket. We reached the ambush site at 2100 hours. 4 Marines dead, 7 wounded. The survivors were holding a perimeter with ammunition they did not have and hoped they were running out of. Harlan set up a position with his rifle and told me to start moving. He would hold the line. He would keep the darkness back. Ezra's voice cracked, but he did not stop. I carried the first man at 2130. Corporal Theodore Calloway. Shrapnel wound to the leg. Femoral artery nicked. I tied my shirt around his thigh and put him across my shoulders and started walking. He looked out at the crowd. 2 miles through the jungle, through the river, through territory we knew was crawling with enemy patrols. Every step I expected to be the last. Every breath I expected to hear the shot that would end it. But Harlan's rifle kept cracking in the darkness behind me, kept telling me he was still there, still holding the line. I reached the extraction zone at 2300 hours, handed Calloway to the medics, turned around, walked back. His voice had taken on a rhythm now, the cadence of an after-action report. Cold, precise, devastating. Private First Class Marcus Reinhold, 19 years old, shot through both legs. I carried him out at midnight. Lance Corporal David YQ, 23, shrapnel in his abdomen. I carried him out at 0130. Sergeant William Fontaine, 31, bullet wound to the shoulder. 0300. Private Jerome Hadley, 18 years old, the youngest of them, crying for his mother the whole way. 0430. Corporal Samuel Okonkwo, 25, unconscious from blood loss. 0600. He paused. The silence was absolute. And then there was one more. Lance Corporal Peter Stanhope, 24 years old, the 7th man, the last man. Ezra looked at Stanhope, standing in the crowd with tears streaming down his face. I was halfway back for him when Harlan's rifle went silent. I knew what that meant. I knew he was out of ammunition. I knew he was making a choice. His voice dropped to barely a whisper, but somehow it carried across the entire plaza. Harlan Yancey charged a machine gun, nest with an empty rifle and a Ka-Bar knife. He bought me 90 seconds. 90 seconds to cross the last stretch of river, to reach the tree line, to get Peter to the helicopter. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the compass, held it up so the morning sun caught the cracked glass. They recovered his body 3 weeks later. This was in his pocket. I have carried it every day since. Every day for 56 years. Because putting it down would mean accepting that he was really gone. He looked at Burgess, at Calloway, at his daughter and his granddaughter, and the hundreds of strangers who were no longer strangers. I did not save 7 men that night, he said. Harlan Yancey saved 7 men. I just carried them. He did the hard part. He did the dying. The plaza was silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a child's voice asking what was happening. Just the morning sun and the bronze soldier and the old man holding a broken compass that still pointed toward home. Calloway stepped forward. His voice was fierce despite the tears. "No," he said. "No, Isri. Harlan made a choice. A brave and terrible choice. But you made 7 choices. 7 times you walked into the darkness. 7 times you could have stopped, and no one would have blamed you. But you did not stop. You kept going. You kept carrying." He gripped Ezra's shoulder. "Harlan held the line so you could bring us home. But you are the one who brought us home. Both things are true. Both things matter. And neither one of you should be forgotten." Ezra looked at the compass in his hand, at the frozen needle, at the cracked glass. "Still here, Harlan," he whispered. "Still trying to be worthy of what you gave." And somewhere in the silence, in the space between memory and mourning, he could almost hear the answer. "You always were, Anchor. You always were." The applause began slowly. A single pair of hands somewhere in the back of the crowd. Then another. Then a wave that built and built until the entire plaza was thundering with it. Not the polite applause of ceremony. Something rawer. Something that came from the chest and the throat and the place where tears are born. Veterans were weeping openly. Families were holding each other. Children who did not fully understand were clapping anyway, caught up in the emotion that rolled across the plaza like a tide. Burgess let it continue for a long moment. Then he raised his hand again, and the applause slowly faded. "There is one more matter to address," he said. His voice had changed. Harder now. Colder. The voice of a commanding officer about to deliver judgment. He turned to look at Ashford. The deputy parks director had not moved. He stood at the edge of the crowd like a man frozen in amber, his face gray, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The security officers had stepped away from him, creating a visible distance, as if his disgrace might be contagious. "Deputy Director Ashford," Burgess said. The title dripped with contempt. "Please step forward." Ashford did not move at first. Then, slowly, as if his legs belonged to someone else, he walked toward the general. Each step seemed to cost him something. Each step brought him closer to the consequences he had earned. "This morning," Burgess continued, his voice carrying across the silent plaza, "you attempted to remove a decorated combat veteran from a public memorial on Memorial Day. You mocked his service. You questioned his sacrifices. You demanded he remove dog tags he has worn for 56 years. You call him a vagrant, a liar, an embarrassment." Ashford's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You did this to a man who holds the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and 3 Purple Hearts. A man whose story is taught at military academies. A man who carried 7 wounded Marines through enemy territory and watched his commanding officer die to save the last one." Burgess stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost intimate, but still carrying in the silence. "You were so concerned with appearances that you could not see the hero standing right in front of you. You were so worried about what the cameras might capture that you became exactly the kind of story you were trying to prevent." He glanced at the phones still raised throughout the crowd, at the journalist still recording. "The cameras did capture something today, Deputy Director. They captured a bureaucrat trying to arrest a legend. They captured everything this day is supposed to stand against. The callousness, the indifference, the way we treat our veterans when no one is watching." Ashford finally found his voice. It came out thin and cracked. "I did not know. How could I have known? He looked like any other homeless person. There was no way to tell." Burgess shook his head slowly. "That is precisely the point. There is no way to tell. The man sleeping under the bridge might be a Medal of Honor recipient. The woman begging on the corner might have served 3 tours in Afghanistan. You cannot know by looking, which is why you treat every veteran, every person, with the dignity they deserve until proven otherwise." He turned back to the crowd. "Deputy Director Ashford will be facing a formal inquiry. His conduct today will be reviewed by the county board and by representatives of the Marine Corps League, the VFW, and every veterans organization that witnessed what happened here." He paused. "I suspect his career in parks management has come to an end." Ashford's legs buckled. He did not fall, but he swayed, reaching out for support that was not there. No one moved to help him. No one offered a hand or a word of comfort. He had earned his isolation the same way Ezra had earned his recognition. Sir, the word came out strangled. Please, I was just doing my job. I was trying to maintain the dignity of the memorial. Burgess turned back to him, and his voice was ice. The dignity of this memorial is not maintained by removing homeless veterans. It is maintained by honoring them. All of them. The ones in uniform and the ones in rags. The ones with medals on their chests and the ones with scars on their souls. He gestured toward Ezra. This man maintained the dignity of this memorial every single day he sat beside it. You are the one who threatened to destroy it. Ashford looked at Ezra, at the weathered face and the worn jacket and the dog tags hanging against his chest, at the man he had tried to erase. I'm sorry, he whispered. His voice was barely audible. I am so sorry. I did not understand. Ezra looked at him for a long moment. The plaza held its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. I spent 8 years believing I did not deserve forgiveness, he said, believing that what I had done, leaving my family, disappearing, giving up, was unforgivable. I sat beside that statue and punished myself every day for sins I thought could never be absolved. He took a step toward Ashford. But my daughter forgave me. The men I saved forgave me. And I'm starting to understand that forgiveness is not about deserving. It is about choosing to set the weight down. He extended his hand. I forgive you, he said, not because you deserve it, but because I'm tired of carrying things that do not need to be carried. Ashford stared at the hand, at the scars and the calluses and the tattoo of 7 names circling the wrist. He reached out slowly, as if afraid the gesture might be withdrawn, and took it. Thank you, he managed. His voice broke completely. Thank you. I will do better. I will be better. Ezra nodded once. Then he turned back to his family, to Maylene and Iris and David, to Calloway and the survivors and the general who had validated what he had spent 56 years trying to forget. The ceremony continued after that. Burgess gave a speech, though not the one he had prepared. He spoke about what it meant to serve, what it meant to sacrifice, what it meant to carry burdens that no one else could see. But the real ceremony had already happened, in the space between a handshake and a forgiveness. In the moment when an old man in a worn jacket had taught a plaza full of people what dignity really looked like. Not the pressed uniforms or the polished medals. Not the speeches or the flags or the bronze statues frozen in eternal sacrifice. Just a man, choosing to forgive, choosing to let go, choosing after 56 years to finally set the weight down. 3 months later, Ezra Whitfield woke before dawn the way he always had. But instead of a park bench in the cold bronze shadow of a statue, he opened his eyes to a small bedroom in his daughter's house in Richmond. A quilt his wife had made 30 years ago covered his legs. Photographs of his granddaughter lined the dresser. And through the window, he could see the first pale light of morning spreading across a yard where irises bloomed in purple and yellow and white. He rose quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and padded down the hallway in bare feet. The house was silent around him, filled with the particular peace of a family sleeping safely under one roof. He stopped at Iris's door, slightly ajar, and listened to her breathing. Then at Maylene's door, where he could hear David's soft snoring and his daughter's occasional murmur. His family, still here, still real, still willing to love him despite everything he had done. The coffee maker in the kitchen was a mystery to him, all digital buttons and programmable settings, but Maylene had taught him how to use it. He started a pot and stood by the window while it brewed, watching the irises sway in the early morning breeze. Loretta would have loved this, he thought. Would have loved seeing Maylene grown and strong. Would have loved Iris, fierce and curious, and carrying pieces of both of them. Would have loved knowing that he had finally found his way home. He touched the compass in his pocket. He still carried it everywhere, would probably carry it until the day he died. But it felt different now. Not a weight, not a punishment, just a reminder of a friend who had given everything so that others could have mornings like this one. The drive to the Veterans Outreach Center took 20 minutes. Marcus Delane had given him a key 3 weeks after the Memorial Day ceremony, after it became clear that Ezra was not going to stop showing up, and after it became equally clear that the other veterans responded to him in ways they did not respond to anyone else. He arrived at 6, an hour before the center officially opened. The building was a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown, filled with folding tables and donated furniture and the particular smell of coffee that had been brewing since the Reagan administration. A dozen cots lined the back wall for emergency overflow from the shelter. A bulletin board near the entrance was covered with job listings and VA information and photographs of success stories, men and women who had found their way back. Ezra's photograph was on that board now. Someone had clipped it from a newspaper article that had run the week after Memorial Day. Local hero revealed, the man behind the statue. He tried to take it down, but Marcus had stopped him. "They need to see it," Marcus had said. "They need to know that even legends can fall, and even the fallen can rise." The first veteran arrived at 6:30. A young man, maybe 30, with the hollow eyes and twitching hands of someone who had not slept in days. He sat down across from Ezra without speaking, just looking at the old man with the scar on his face and the worn compass on the table between them. Ezra did not push, did not ask questions, just poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table. "I was you," he said finally. "I lived on the streets for 8 years. I hated myself. I wanted to disappear. I sat beside a statue of myself and believed I did not deserve to exist." The young man looked up. His voice was raw. "How did you come back?" Ezra considered the question, considered all the answers he could give, all the platitudes and programs and steps to recovery. "I did not," he said finally. "Not alone. My daughter found me. The men I saved found me. People I did not even know refused to let me vanish." He touched the compass. "I did not come back because I was strong enough. I came back because other people were strong enough to carry me when I could not carry myself." The young man stared at him. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched the compass. Just for a moment, just long enough to feel the connection. "I do not know if I can come back," he whispered. "You do not have to know," Ezra said. "You just have to stay long enough to find out." The morning passed the way mornings at the center always passed. Veterans drifting in and out. Conversations that went nowhere and conversations that went everywhere. A woman who had served 3 tours in Iraq and could not stop seeing the faces of children she could not save. A man who had lost both legs to an IED and lost his marriage to the anger that followed. Stories of loss and survival, of falling and fighting to stand again. Ezra listened to all of them, did not judge, did not preach, just listened and sometimes spoke and sometimes simply sat in silence with people who needed to know that silence was acceptable too. At noon, Maylene arrived with lunch. She had started doing this 3 times a week, bringing food from the restaurant down the street, eating with her father and the veterans he was trying to help. Iris came sometimes too, sitting in the corner doing homework, absorbing stories that would shape the woman she was becoming. "You look tired," Maylene said, setting a sandwich in front of him. "Good tired," Ezra replied. "The kind that means something." She smiled. The same smile her mother had given him 1,000 times. The smile that said, "I see you, and I love you, and I am not going anywhere." After lunch, he drove to the memorial. He still went once a month, though not to sit alone in the shadow of his own statue. Now he went with Maylene, with Iris, sometimes with Calloway and his grandchildren. They would stand together and read the names on the plaque and tell stories about the men who had come home and the one who had not. Today, a young Marine in dress blues stood at attention before the statue. He could not have been older than 20, fresh from training, probably visiting the memorial before his first deployment. His eyes moved from the bronze soldier to the old man approaching with his family, and something in his face shifted. "You are him," the young Marine said. His voice was odd. "You are Gunnery Sergeant Whitfield. I studied the perfume river extraction at boot camp. They told us you were dead." Ezra looked up at the statue, at his own face, younger and stronger, frozen forever in the act of carrying his brother home. "I was," he said, "for a while, but I got better." The young Marine did not know what to say to that. Ezra did not expect him to. Some things could only be understood by living through them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a challenge coin. It had been minted after the ceremony, bearing the image of the statue on one side and the coordinates of the Perfume River extraction on the other. Calloway had given him 100 of them, and Ezra had been giving them away ever since. "Carry this," he said, pressing it into the young Marine's hand. "And when things get hard, and they'll get hard, remember that carrying your brothers is not just about the battlefield. It is about the years after, the days when the weight feels impossible, the nights when you want to disappear." He closed the Marine's fingers around the coin. "Find your people. Let them carry you. And when you are strong enough, carry them back. That is how we survive. Not alone. Together." The young Marine looked at the coin, then at the old man, then at the statue. "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant," he said. His voice was thick. "I will remember." Ezra nodded once. Then he turned back to his family, to his daughter and his granddaughter and the life he had almost thrown away. Still here, Harlan, he thought, touching the compass one last time. Still trying, but not alone anymore. Never alone again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that healing is possible, that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, there's a veteran sitting alone, believing they do not deserve kindness, believing they do not deserve family, believing they do not deserve to be seen. Maybe this story finds them. Maybe it reminds them that the greatest act of courage is not charging into fire. It is accepting help. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Thank you for watching.